Tonight's lesson, it's not one that's just a real uplifting lesson, unfortunately, but it's one that could do a lot of good, though, hopefully. It's dealing with a subject that I know that a lot of people have had experience with, and we're talking about some different things concerning myths of depression. And I know right now with the present distress that's going on, it can be depressing. And then I realized also that there's some who have to deal with this on a regular basis in their life. And so it's something that is good for us to talk about every once in a while. And in this season that we are approaching right now, unfortunately, though it's a happy season, and in many ways it also can cause extra stress for people. And so hopefully this can be a practical lesson tonight. As you go through life, all of us have mentors, people that just have made a great impact on our lives. And so one of those for me was Dr. Dal Flatt. Dr. Dal Flatt, distantly related to me, professor and actually head of the Bible department at the wonderful Freed-Hardeman University for many years. And Dr. Flatt struggled a lot with depression. In fact, he was diagnosed in his later years. It was an onset of it was fairly late for him in life, actually, with manic depressive psychosis, bipolar type of illness and problems that he had to deal with. And so he struggled greatly with that for several years, and unfortunately had an untimely death a couple of years ago. But he made a great impact on my life. And before, probably about a year before his death, he wrote a tract that was just an incredible work. I thought it was just really powerful along this very line as he was struggling with, dealing with that problem. And so he wrote a tract entitled Myths of Depression. And so this lesson is in honor of the material that he presented in that tract, and it's something that is very special to me. I believe everything that he said in it. I think he really did a lot of careful study. And Dr. Flatt, through the years, he heard a lot of people say a lot of things about depression. And, he started studying about all those things, and he decided that, I think some of these may be accurate, some are not so accurate. And so as a result, then he presented this particular material that I want to share with you tonight. If you think about depression, everybody has had it at one time or another. It's one of those things that's common to life. Depression is considered as being the loss of something, and it's either a real or a perceived loss of something. And it could be something as minor as the loss of maybe some kind of jewelry or watch, or maybe a loss of money. And that, of course, creates this feeling inside of a person of being somewhat depressed, all the way to a full-blown depression-type situation, such as what Dr. Flatt had to experience in his life with the chemical imbalance. And there are many different things that are talked about in the community, their medical community, along that line. And there's been some great things that have been done over the last several years to make some real improvements in individuals' lives. There's a lot of hope in that way. And we give God the glory for all of that. Anything that man does that is positive in nature, we give God the glory, because He created man with the ability to do some research and to come up with some things that can be helpful to a lot of people. So depression is something that we have to deal with from time to time, and some seem to have to deal with it more than others. One of the myths that concerning depression is the idea that depression is sinful, that sinful Christians would never be able to be depressed. A depressed person is not a Christian. And conversely, if you're a Christian, you'd be smiling and happy all the time. And there are some people who have been really hard on Christians throughout the years to try to make, their point that you need to be all buoyant at all times, happy at all times. And at times, they've used the Apostle Paul along that line. They've kind of quoted him. Nothing wrong with quoting the Apostle Paul, because he spoke through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And this Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians 4, verse 4, to rejoice in the Lord always. And so he sounded like a person who was happy, didn't he? And he wrote that while he's in a prison. So that wouldn't be easy to rejoice in a prison, would it? But he was happy, and he was a happy man. But he also wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, that he despaired of life. That doesn't mean he was afraid he'd lose his life. It meant that he was at a point where he just didn't enjoy living anymore. He was very, very depressed. And so which one of those is accurate? Which one of those would be the Apostle Paul? Both of them would. And if I were to have interviewed him when he wrote that about despairing of life, or if I would have talked to him, or you would have talked to him when he was despairing of life. And you would have said, well, I thought you wrote to rejoice in the Lord always, and again rejoice. I say rejoice. He would have said, I did write that. And then he would also say, but I have moments where I'm down also, and I'm frustrated, and I have depression as well. And so he would be certainly the first one to say something along that line. He wrote in Philippians chapter 4, 7, and 8, in nothing be anxious, he said. In everything, through supplications and prayers, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep or guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Beautiful passage there. Also, though, he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, that he worried a lot over the churches. And I suppose he may have had some depression over some of the things going on with some of the churches. So you wouldn't want to say the Apostle Paul was a sinful man. I mean, you would in one sense. He committed sins like you and I do, Romans 3:23, but he's not a sinner in the sense of rebelling against God. Other than Jesus, he's probably one of the most righteous individuals we read about in the Word of God. So if depression is sinful, what are you going to say about Paul then in a situation like that? And so that's one of the myths of depression. Secondly, there is the myth that depression is a punishment from God. You must have done something, and so God is kind of laying that on you and burdening you with that depression and maybe disciplining you with that depression because of something you've done that is bad. Well, that ought to bring a familiar tone to us because of dealing with Job, right? We've been talking about Job in our class, and with Job, this was a man who was righteous, turned away from evil, loved the Lord, offered sacrifices for his children. Job ends up being in a situation where he loses his children. He has the physical malady of all the sores on his body, and he's dealing with all of that. And he has these friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And these individuals, they speak out all their wisdom, and they try to point out that Job is probably an unrighteous man. God's punishing him, and he needs to confess all of his sins, and then maybe God will turn things around for him. Well, what does Job do throughout the book? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm trying to live a good life, and I've tried to be faithful to God. I don't see myself as an individual who has turned away from God. I still hate evil, and I still love the Lord. And if he had children, he still would have offered sacrifices. But the man probably couldn't even get up and walk hardly anymore. He hurt so severely. But certainly you wouldn't look at Job and say that God was punishing him, because the truth of the matter is, we look at James 1:13, where we're told that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Which means God doesn't try people with evil things in the sense of using evil to hurt people. He's not that kind of God. He doesn't do that. Elijah was a wonderful man of God. In 1 Kings chapter 19, you remember after he had the successful campaign against the prophets of Baal, and after that had occurred and the prophets of Baal were slain, and they'd had the contest about whose sacrifice could be lit from heaven, and he even had water poured upon the bullocks that were chosen. And even with that, the water was lapped up and fire burst out, and then the people of the prophets of Baal were slain. And then after that had occurred, then Jezebel, wicked Jezebel, said, by this time tomorrow you're going to be as dead as those prophets. And it scared the man. It scared the man. She bullied the man. And so he was then at a point where he just sat down next to this juniper tree, and he just says, I just think I ought to die. I just want to die. I don't want to go on right now. I'm the only one that's left and that really cares. Nobody cares. And I'm just so depressed. Probably what he had was considered as the post-adrenaline type depression. Soldiers have that a lot of times. They've been in a battle and they're just worn out. They've been just running on fumes for days, and they finally have a chance to catch their breath. And so all the trauma they've been through just kind of resurfaces in their life. Maybe it was something like that Elijah had gone through. You wouldn't think, though, that Elijah was being punished by God, was he? Of course not. He was a servant of the Lord, so depression is not a punishment from God. In John 10, verse 10, Jesus says, the thief comes not but for to kill, steal, and destroy. I'm come that they might have life and have it more abundantly. Depression does all three of those things. It steals people's time. Individuals who are in deep depression often do not get to enjoy their families like they would like to. It takes away from one's productivity. Many people who are depressed they're not able to work. I know a man in Nashville, Tennessee. He works for the fire department there. And he has missed over 2 or 3 years of work because of depression. And they're good enough to him there to allow him to do that. But look how much work he could have done had it not been for that particular problem in his life. It steals, it kills, it destroys. In many lives, suicidal depression, that has ended the life of wonderful people here on this earth. And so it's a sad thing, but it is not a punishment from God. A third myth is that it's a product of a lack of faith. If you had more faith, you would not get depressed. Preachers have said that over the years. And I say to them very respectfully that they're wrong. They're just wrong. That's not true. Well, let's go back to our interview with the Apostle Paul. Paul, we decided tonight that depression is a result of a lack of faith. What do you think about that? Try that out on Paul. Here's a man who admitted being depressed. And so what do you think? I'm going to tell you the Apostle Paul was a valiant soldier of Christ. And he had faith, strong faith. What about Jesus? As he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, I may be wrong, but I think I'm seeing a depressed man right there, aren't you? This isn't a man who went to the cross with the idea of a buoyant spirit and thinking this is okay, I don't mind it whatsoever. Now he, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. So he was glad to do it in one sense. But he seemed to me to be deeply depressed as he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, don't you think? So you think Jesus had faith? Of course he had faith. What about Elijah? Of course Elijah had faith. And yet all of these suffered from depression. Some have thought that depression, and a fourth myth concerning it, could be cured by just become more spiritual. That's what you need to do. Just get more spiritual and you won't have that old depression anymore. Read your Bible more. Pray more. Go to church more. That'll do it. That'll take care of it. That's probably what's going on. You're not going to church enough. You're not reading your Bible enough. You're not praying enough. Well, I would say that there are some people who have been depressed who have not read their Bible as much as they should. And they've gone to church like they ought to. They've not prayed like they ought to. But I'm willing to also say that I would say there are many who might read their Bible more and pray more and go to church more than many individuals who never dealt with major depression. In fact, they may be there a lot more than others are. And they may read the Bible a lot more and pray a lot more. So that doesn't always work as far as that line of reasoning. And there are individuals, of course, who exploit people. TV evangelists are sometimes among the top individuals who do that, first on the list, to try to find a way to make a lot of money off of people who are depressed, letting you know that you can be more like me, this successful televangelist. If you'll contribute money to this ministry, and I'll give you this book, and then that'll take care of all this problem with depression. You'll become more spiritual like I am. That line of reasoning often is used. That line of reasoning probably wouldn't work very well with someone, let's say, with pancreatic cancer, would it? I knew a man in that situation several years ago, and there was a lady who came to his home, and she said, his name was Paul. She said, "Paul, do you want to be healed?" And he said, "Well, I sure do. I'd love to be healed." And she said, "Okay, I'm going to pray for you, and you'll be healed of your pancreatic cancer. No problem at all. And you've got to have faith. You've got to be a spiritual man." He said, "Well, I'm trying." I could vouch for the fact that he was. He was trying to be a very spiritual man, good man, godly man, no doubt about it. Well, she prayed for him. She said, "Now, Paul, I want to see you back on your tractor again," because he did a lot of farm work. And so everything's fine. "You're healed." He said, "You're cured." She said, "You're cured. Everything's fine." Well, unfortunately, Paul passed away a couple of months later. It just wasn't spiritual enough. Maybe he should have prayed more. Maybe he should have read more Bible. We wouldn't use that line of reasoning, would we, in a situation like that? So why would we use that line of reasoning with someone who's dealing with depression? How unfair for someone to be dealt with in that way. And then this next thing is partially true, partially not true. And that is that depression is something you can end. It is something you can end in many cases. There are many things that can be done to help people with depression. One of the things is exercise, activity. Another is just the idea of pressing on. If you take the word depression, inside the word is semi-cure for a lot of the depression situations. Pressing on, you press on. And then you get I out of the way there, and that's where it happens a lot of times with depression too. It's a self-centered type of thing, and I don't mean by that to be insulting in any way. I'm just meaning that you're forced to focus in on you. You really aren't able to focus in much on others whenever you're depressed, and that's just it. It's kind of like having somebody has just hit your toe with a hammer. I'm sorry about the war going on in Iraq and the problems we're having and problems with taxes and all that, but right now my toe is killing me. So it's along that same line, depression is that way. It forces you to sort of look inward. And so if a person forces themselves to look outward, then they can do a lot to help themselves with depression. And they can sometimes end their depression. But there are many depressions that don't respond that way. There are many that are bigger and tougher than that. And so they don't always work in just that way. And in fact, for a person who's dealing with what we sometimes call a chemical depression or biologically induced depression, that can push them down a lot further. You never would want to say something like that to a person who's dealing with depression. There was a preacher once who had a sermon entitled, or that with the concept of, I should say, that anything the mind can conceive, the body can achieve. Sounds good, doesn't it? You buy into that? Nah, it's not true, is it? I could conceive of me being a really good NBA basketball player. I would just think that would be so fun. To be able to jump up there and slam dunk a ball through a hoop. Can get close to a hoop. I could get on a step ladder and they won't let you do that. So I can conceive it. So can I achieve that? I wouldn't put any money on it, would you? And so that's always something that you realize that has to be taken with a big grain of salt. And so when it comes to depression, you might say, okay, I'm just going to quit doing this. I'm not going to let myself stay depressed anymore. You can try, and in many cases that's true, but in some cases it's not true. Sometimes it may be a little bit tougher tree to chop down than just that. And then I've seen Christians despair in situations like that and get so down on themselves and frustrated and believing that I just don't know what to do, and so maybe God doesn't love me. Truth of the matter is, there's a lot of hope for you and a lot of help out there that God can use individuals to help you with. And so it can be done. There's a lot of good things, but you should never get down on yourself. If you had something like this and you're not able just to make it stop at the snap of a finger, it can be a lot tougher than that. Another thing, too, that is a myth is that depression is all about the same. Now, I remember once a lady came to my office when I was in my mid-20s, and she was a counselor, and she told me about some of her problems, and she said, and I'm a counselor. She said, I remember her saying this like it was yesterday, I know all the tricks, she said, and none of them are working right now. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's really bad, I hate that for her. That's about it. That's about all that I was able to do on that, is just think, that's really bad. But I thought to myself, she ought to just get over it. She ought to get over that. Why is she struggling with a thing like that? And see, my line of reasoning was that it's all about the same. Well, that's real easy for a person to say who's not dealt with depression. But it's not all the same, is it? I mean, it can be something that can be unraveling, horrifying feeling that goes to putting a person into the depths of despair that words cannot describe. All depression is not the same. This very man who wrote this tract was told once by one of his colleagues, just think about something else. Just kind of get over it. Don't keep dwelling on something like that. For the person who's dealing with major depression, you know what that's like? That's like somebody telling you to stand on a rope and lift yourself in the air. You can't do it like that. Not all depression is the same. Now, that person who would say to him, just get over it, how would that person interpret Matthew 7:12? All things that you would that others should do to you, do you also to them. There's a lot of things I don't understand about people, but I still want to love them and be empathetic with them. That doesn't sound very empathetic. Job's friends, if they were really going to be great friends and love him, they wouldn't kick him while he's down, would they? They instead would say, we don't understand what all's happened to you, Job, but we sure believe in you, and we believe in God. And so we're just going to keep praying for you all the time. All depression is not the same. Big difference between a Blue Monday and a major depression. It's like the difference between a thunderstorm and a hurricane, and we sure know the difference down here about that. And then some believe that depression is totally situational. Not always true. Many times that's true. There are people who have different situations that cause their depression. If you've lost a loved one, of course you feel depression, and everybody understands that. And it may be a very deep depression. We understand that. But I know a man that when he was, in about his mid-30s, somebody told this fella that he was the happiest person that they'd ever seen in his life, in their life. And he said, yeah, that's about right. That same person, about 6 months later, was battling with a depression that was so incredible that he seriously didn't want to go on living. Now, if you think about a situation like that, you think, well, what happened to him during that time? We'll never know. We'll never know. He doesn't know what happened to him during that time. Well, maybe his family, he had problems with that storybook life. Wonderful family. Maybe his job wasn't good. Great job. Great job. Everybody loved him on his job. He had a wonderful job. Storybook life. Everything was great. What happened to him? We don't know. We don't know. It just happened. Sometimes it's that way. Because the first thing you do if somebody were to say, I'm really depressed, what were you going to say to them? Well, what's wrong? What's wrong? That's normal, isn't it? You're not doing an abnormal thing by saying something like that to a friend, are you? What's wrong? Sometimes no one knows exactly what's wrong. A great friend of mine, from the time he was 11 years old, started having panic attack syndrome. You know anything about panic attack syndrome? It's a feeling that there's a line in the room and yet there's not really one there. And it's not that you're actually fantasizing there's one there and somebody has to convince you. That's a psychosis, a departure from reality. But instead it is a feeling of intense nervous reaction. Heart is just beating a mile a minute. It's one of those things where you're just scared, frightened. Many people go to the emergency room, present themselves there only to find out that they weren't having a heart attack, that everything is okay physiologically. Comes out of nowhere. Might awaken you at 3 o'clock in the morning. He struggled with this throughout his lifetime. Was a successful jet mechanic in the Air Force, and yet still had panic attack syndrome. Wouldn't tell anybody about it. He's 55 years old. He'd already chosen the way he was going to go ahead and end his life because he had made up his mind. He was just crazy. He's crazy. He couldn't do anything for him. And he was having more of those. His wife had to be gone more frequently to take care of his mother-in-law, and she wasn't there, and he was getting more and more depressed. And then he finally, as a last resort, told his wife. And he said, honey, I don't think I can go on. Well, what's going on? And then he explained to her for the first time in their married life about panic attack syndrome. He went to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist looked at him and said, we can cure this. He said, I don't believe you. He said, I don't care. I don't care if you believe me or not. He said, you will be cured. He said, I don't believe in just medicines that you take and you make yourself think you're feeling better. He said, I don't care if you don't even like the medicine. It doesn't matter to me whatsoever. You're going to be cured, so don't worry about it. He took the medicine. He's perfectly normal and healthy right now. Everything is fine. But he thought very seriously about ending his life. Not all depressions are the same. Endogenous means that it's inside, and we don't always know what's causing it. Exogenous means it's outside, or usually situational. And, you know, you look at medications that can be used, and some of those are centered around trying to cause the neurotransmission inside, with the nerves and the cranial cavity, to be able to function better. And a person who's severely depressed, when they've done anything that focuses in on the brain, it looks like there's not many lights on. Doesn't mean there's not intelligence there. Just means that they're not functioning well as far as the neurotransmission is concerned. And so what ends up happening then is that person is depressed because of that. Now, maybe some situations may cause that to occur, or it may just be that that has occurred, and then there can be some problems then as a result of that. But any way you look at it, then with a healthy, normal brain, there's more activity going on. Medicines that can be used that can be helpful to people can cause a person to do better in that way and to feel better. They sleep better. Their thoughts, instead of being circular, a person who has major depression, they can get off of that depression for a while, but it swirls right back around to them again. it just kind of goes back around like a boomerang effect. They can't get away from it. Good medications can be helpful to cause people to get more linear in their thought pattern, where they can solve problems again. They can think more clearly, and they do better because of that. Medicines alone, I don't believe, and this is just one man's opinion, the Apostle Paul would do that every once in a while, wouldn't he? These things say I, not the Lord. But I don't think medicines alone can cure a person, but they sure can help. And don't be afraid of that. You wouldn't be afraid to take medicines if you had a cold, would you? Why would you be afraid to take medicine if it could help a person feel better? Nothing wrong with that. Not talking about abusing yourself in any way, but don't be afraid of that. Some Christians are. You don't need to be. Don't be afraid of that. That could be very helpful to you. And there's so much hope, so much hope. But everything to God be the glory, because God has created people with the ability to help us to know how to feel better in situations like that. But I'm going to tell you this. I've lived on this earth for 51 years. That's not a long time comparatively. But there is no one who's ever made me feel better than Jesus Christ. And He is, in my opinion as a Christian, I'll give you, if you want to call this a testimony, it's fine. That's my testimony. There's nobody who makes me happier than my Lord does. Because He's with you. He's with you every day. He's with you every day, and He loves you every day. And not only that, but don't you just love John 14, where He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I do that, I'll come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Whether I go, you know, and the way you know. Now that's got to make a person feel happy right there. We're going to be going to a place where there's no more tears, no more sorrow, no more pain, and no more death. Well, that makes me want to grin from ear to ear just right there, doesn't it? There's a lot of joy when you think about that. There's a lot of things to live for as you live the Christian life. It's a wonderful life. I like 2 Corinthians 4, 16 through 18, and kind of close with that. So we shouldn't lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, the inward man is being renewed day by day. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we don't look at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. The things that are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that beautiful place called heaven, where there is no depression. It's a place where everybody's happy. Can't be happy without Jesus. You can get by and try to get by and function. Can't be happy without Jesus. Do you know the Lord? If you don't know the Lord, this would be a wonderful night for you to really start getting acquainted with your best friend, Jesus Christ, who died for you on the cross of Calvary. It's a personal relationship. It involves you being close to Him. It involves you obeying His will. He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. John 14, 15. And that involves, of course, what it takes to get into Christ. We realize that. Obeying the gospel, which is completed by being baptized into Christ, immersed into Christ for the forgiveness of sins. But that's something that any of us here as Christians have never regretted, becoming a Christian and walking with our best friend Jesus every day. Or if you need to come back to the Lord and ask for prayers, we'd be glad to pray for you, whatever the situation might be. We'd be honored to do that. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we invite you to come to Him now. Let's stand and sing together.